Hello, everybody, and welcome to our very first edition of the Sunday Shot. I am Jo Dyer, talking to you from the unceded land of the mighty Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'm joined today by my co-host, the editor of The Shot, Dave Milner. Hello, Dave, an auspicious day for us.
G'day, Joe. What are we doing?
What are we doing indeed? Sunday. Well, look, the Sunday Shot, I think it was, is part of the Shot's nascent desire to take over the world, obviously, but...
No, we're going to be quiet about that part.
Yeah. But look, it was born out of a sense of frustration of the direction of the ABC's Insiders that used to be something that we would all watch religiously. And now, despite the occasional insightful guest, we still love you, Laura, Nikki. It too often showcases predictable Murdoch journalists, coalition talking points, tedious framing of the debate, gotcha questions, and a lot of Peter Dutton says. Not something that we wanted to spend our Sunday morning doing.
And so I guess we can just acknowledge that the bar is very low to begin with. So we'll manage some expectations around that. And we won't talk about this for too long. We want to do our own thing, not let them set the agenda. But basically, it's a profoundly annoying show. So profoundly annoying that it's compelled us to get out of bed and run our own show. So, I mean, that says quite a lot. And we have some excellent guests with us today to help us with that.
We do. And look, I think what we did want to do is, it's an election year, so we wanted to have an open and honest and hopefully rigorous discussion about the issues that are confronting us all, because it seems really unfair, but we are living in fairly bleak times. And so we are standing against the forces of darkness, the Murdochs, the Trumps, the Musks, et al., to spread a little bit of light, inspired by that old folkloric wisdom that says there are two wolves inside all of us, and they are always fighting. One is darkness and despair, and the other is light and hope. Which wolf wins? The one you feed. So let's get on with it. To help us feed the wolf of light, the very first panellists for the Sunday Shot are founder and editor of the Klaxon, Anthony Klan, and Crikey contributor, co-host of Melbourne 3RR's Spin Cycle and previous long-term writer and editor of the then must-read daily newsletter, The Politics, Rachel Withers. Welcome to you both.
Thank you very much.
Before we get underway, just a small indulgence that we'll ask of you. This is our very first show, obviously, and our producer Denise and I have spent quite a long time getting up to scratch on our new streaming software. If there are technical glitches, we promise that they won't last long. It's a work in progress, and we hope you will stay with us as we grow, develop, evolve, etc. So, Rachel and Anthony, it was Parliament these last couple of weeks. There was a slightly end of school vibe going on. It felt there was a lot of clearing of the decks happening by the Albanese government. Chalmers and Katie Gallagher say they're still working on the budget, but we'll see if Parliament does return for that the budget date. One of the major things that the major pieces of legislation that felt was very important to get done and dealt with from the government was the Electoral law reform bill. That probably was the most controversial from a kind of political management point of view. Rachel, what have we got in terms of this bill? I think there's probably three areas. There's the transparency, there's the spending caps, and then there's some of these little nasty sting in the tails that we will go into as well. But in a nutshell, what did the government manage to get passed?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, there were multiple little elements to this bill. What they passed in the end was something that had, I think we could break it down into donation caps, which limited how much people could donate to political parties, which was where the government was really selling it as getting big money out of politics and really framing it around specifically the Teals and Clive Palmer. And so what we ended up with there was caps on donations they were raised in the end after negotiations with the coalition to 50,000. They were going to be 20,000 and they were taken up to 50, which we can get into it, but there's a way that advantages the major parties. And then there was spending caps, which is about how much can be spent in an election. There are different spending caps for individual campaigns So for individual candidates, it's a cap of $800,000 that can be spent, which is a lot less than was spent by some of the community independents in 2022. And then there is an overall cap of how much a party can spend, which is set at 90 million, which is a very different number to 800.
It sure is.
Of course, that's for the entire country, but the complaint coming from many of the independents is that means that actually parties can then outspend independents quite significantly by using their entire party spend on individual electorates where they're facing an independent challenger.
I have to confess to being distracted by the anti-Semitism stuff and the ethnic cleansing stuff. I've missed some of these details. So we're saying that parties can spend $90 million on campaigns and individuals can spend $800,000? Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, and that I think is the independents and integrity experts have issues with many different parts of this bill, but I think that's the one that really speaks to that tilting of the playing field and this suggestion that this was actually about trying to entrench the two-party system and protect the two-party system as the rise of independence continues and as the two major parties with primary votes continue to collapse. They've tweaked the rules here so that they can actually significantly outspend their opponents, and in various ways they can also raise more money than their opponents as well. This is something that I think we can all agree actually that we probably do need some caps on spending in elections to prevent us ending up America, but these numbers seem to have been set in a quite a secretive way. There was no inquiry as to what this would do, how fair it is. It was done basically in a closed door deal with Labor and the coalition, where various tweaks were also made to appease the coalition to make them even more favourable to the major parties.
So call me cynical, but if I was a political duopoly trying to entrench my position in power, I would probably do exactly this sort of thing.
You would do exactly this. Yeah, it's the biggest. It's a monster stitch up. It's a disgrace. I've been following this in depth for quite some time.
Oh, I think we've lost Anthony for a minute.
Oh dear.
Like we said, managing expectation.
I mean, I think one point. Oh, here he is.
Anthony, your internet dropped out, mate. Continue.
Am I back?
You are, but you're back.
Okay, good. Just while I'm back, yeah, it's a monster stitch up. The ALP's organised it with the coalition behind the scenes. It's claimed that it's been, doing dealings for 3 years. Well, it's been doing dealings, behind closed doors with the coalition. It's been described as, one of the darkest days for Australian democracy, and that's spot on. This goes to the heart of how we're funded. You've seen this. The increase from the original idea was to make every donation over $1,000 disclosed. Now they've made it $5,000, which is quite a lot more. But a key issue here is the AEC, Australian Electoral Commission, behind the scenes 12 months ago ripped.
Okay, Anthony, we're having a few issues with your internet at the moment,
I'll leave it over to you.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I found so interesting, it was a stitch up, and do you think, Rachel, that the way that Don Farrell went about conducting these negotiations, the sort of the bad faith way in which he acted, is going to have soured the relationship between the independents and the government moving forward, and particularly if there are going to be issues around, if it is a minority government and they may need them to form or to stay on the government benches?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think the relationship has been soured, and we've been hearing the independents basically the whole multi-year process that this has been going on, criticising the way it's been done. But I think you saw it come to a head on Thursday morning when Don Farrell was giving a press conference in the halls of Parliament. They'd done the deal, it had gone through the Senate, it was about to be rushed through the House, and Zali Steggall, the independent member for Warringah, and I suppose the first of the current crop of Teals, but I'm going to keep putting that in quotes. But she confronted him in the hallway and basically started grilling him. And we do see these corridor exchanges from time to time. I sort of love them. They're a bit of political theatre, but I think she was right to do it in front of the media because it's all been done away from the media and it's been done out of sight. And she was going, well, we had to hear about these reforms and what was actually in them in the media. So why can't we have this conversation in front of the media? The government had promised it was going to consult the crossbench. Sorry, that's my dog. She's very upset about this. She thinks we should all be very upset about this. But yeah, they said they were going to consult the crossbench. There was talk of Anthony Albanese personally promising to consult them more over the summer break. And then it seems like they got a really cursory kind of last minute meeting where Don Farrell didn't even show up. There is, I will shout out a pretty good piece from Tom Crowley in the ABC today going through kind of how that deal went down and how the independents were treated by Don Farrell. And you know, if you know anything about Don Farrell, like he is your classic Labor numbers man, backroom dealer, factional warlord, like every Labor faceless man stereotype rolled into one.
Yeah, well, coming from South Australia, I'm very familiar with Don Farrell. Anthony, you have been doing work on this beyond just these particular reforms and the way that transparency has been diminished over the course, and Don Farrell apparently having a hand in that as well. Talk us through some of what you've learned. Hopefully your internet will stay with us to get through this, and about the way that we actually, despite these much trumpeted reforms, in the background at the moment, there's work being done which is actually lessening our capacity to know who's giving money to whom and when. No, we don't have Anthony, so... yes, we do.
Am I back again?
You are.
I'm currently in Queensland and it's on a 100 NBN fibre to the home plug-in. So, I mean, I don't know what's going on, but there you go. Thanks, NBN.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Telstra. Hey, the entire point of political donations transparency, of course, is knowing who's making the donation, right? So, 12 months ago, the Australian Electoral Commission pulled its entire transparency register. Now, that's where you go if you want to work out where the donations are made, who's making what donations, etc. So they pulled the whole thing, and the excuse we later found out was that there was an error that the AEC had conducted or made 5 years beforehand.
Dogs barking, Anthony dropping in and out. Episode 1.
I do know that Anthony's done excellent work on the Klaxon, like exactly what he's about to tell us.
Okay, you're back, Anthony.
Yeah. So in any event, they've put these. They put the register back online, but the key material you need is the original disclosures. This is the document that the donor fills out, the party fills out. That shows you who's made the donations, right? So they've pulled all of those for good under the name of privacy. Now, what we established was it was. Am I still cutting out or?
No, you're good now.
Cool.
Shaking my head because I can't believe the things you're saying.
Oh, it's unbelievable, right? And so I've been at them, and they came back and they gave me one of these disclosure forms. And this stuff's vital. I mean, this was vital in working out who Advance was, who was funding Advance, who was behind them for the No campaign against The Voice. So they're saying where there's this grassroots movement of ordinary Aussies and all these lies, it's actually a handful of mega millionaires and billionaires. So we needed this information. Now we can't get it. And so they've done this under the excuse of privacy. So we've gone, hang on, so what's this breach you're going on about? It says the AEC became aware of this breach. Who did it become aware of? You dig into it. Farrell's office. Farrell, while it's writing these laws, gets in touch with the AEC, raises this issue from 5 years beforehand, uses that excuse to hide all the forms. Now they've
Okay. We've lost you again, Anthony. So we've understand that we've been using as an excuse to hide a lot of things, and that in the past you have basically you've used a lot of that information to identify. So part of what you were able to do during the Voice campaign is to identify that there was no grassroots sort of campaign at work. There were just a few kind of billionaires who were bad actors, as Thomas Mayo would say, and that information is now no longer available.
Exactly. So it's not transparency reform at all. It's hiding more information than we had before. So it's actually worse off. Plus, the majors are getting vastly more funding than the independents. So it's all about kneecapping independence, corrupting democracy. It's a full disgrace. I'm really angry about it.
Anthony and Rachel, I think lots of people watching this will be frustrated that the ALP keeps on siding with the coalition to erode these democratic norms. And I think some people have a hard time understanding why they're doing that when there's so much money being pumped into far-right disinformation campaigns and all that. Could you explain some of that to people, please?
The ALP and the Liberal Party are run by the same.
Oh, Anthony, you're having real issues with your internet, so...
I'm going to assume he was about to say they're in cahoots.
Rach, jump in there.
I have been questioning myself why Labor would do something that obviously they have a vested interest in maintaining the two-party system that benefits them, but also that it does seem like this is going to benefit the coalition even more because they are the ones currently really at threat from well-organised community independence. That is coming for Labor too, but the big money is actually in the well-funded independents, I think we should say, the ones they're trying to cap the spending of, are actually taking on the coalition. So it's sort of baffling. I just think, I think what this legislation says is that we believe in a two-party system. We believe in a duopoly. We believe that parties should get to run really expensive national campaigns, and sure, challengers can have a go on an individual electorate level, but they just really believe that it should be this battle between these two increasingly similar entities, but they prefer it that way. They don't like having other people in the system. There's some quote, I think, that when Anthony Albanese first met with the 2022 batch of new crossbenchers, the 6 women who won Liberal seats, he sort of said something like, "Oh, it's great to have you here, but no more thanks." They don't like having to share power, even though that is where we're headed.
Entitlement. It's
with the primary votes just going down and down and down, and that third force getting stronger and stronger and stronger. Like it's almost guaranteed that they are going to be dealing with a hung parliament situation after the election, and they're going to have to get used to it. But they never really got used to it in the Senate, where they've had to deal with this for some time anyway. They've never really accepted, the Greens as holding like a significant portion of seats in the Senate and someone that therefore has to be listened to and dealt with respectfully.
And it is kind of incredible, really, that you would think for a progressive left-of-centre party that actually...
Sorry, who are we calling a left-of-centre party?
Sorry, well, at least notionally they were, and I think that the idea that the Greens are the anathema and that you can't do strike deals across the centre left to advance and progress the politics of this country, rather than, as the Labor Party has done on many different issues, and the Anti-Corruption Commission is a case in point. And so we've got this very weak, poor version of what we wanted, because they insisted upon doing the deal with the coalition and having this sort of centrist, centre-right kind of miasma, rather than trying to find natural allies amongst other areas. And I think when Simon Holmes, the court, first met with John Farrell to talk about the electoral law reforms, and he said, this is going to entrench the duopoly, Farrell is rumoured to have said to him, that's the fucking point. And maybe, with humour in his voice, but nonetheless, I think that is the way that they want to go.
I think it's quite clear that is the point of this. I mean, you having sort of both Farrell and Liberal politicians who've been involved in negotiating this saying this is about big money, this is that. But I struggle to see how they can believe that when they've gone and rushed this through. The Centre for Public Integrity says that there should have been an inquiry. This is incredibly secretive and poorly done. And I struggle to understand how they believe their own bullshit sometimes.
I don't think they do. I think if this was about big money, they'd be telling Gina Reinhart to get out of politics, and no one's doing that.
And I think I'd add, it's very telling that, we've just had what people are speculating could be the last sitting week of this parliament, and it was spent on donation reforms that are pretty cooked and don't actually take effect until after the next election, rather than on anything major or anything to actually fix many of the problems that continue to plague the country. Obviously, there are many things that Labor wants to keep up its sleeve to run on an election campaign. They couldn't necessarily pass all the plans they have, but to spend the week, like, really, what else went on apart from much of the usual back and forth about anti-Semitism and these electoral reforms. I mean, the thing that really got me was like about 2 weeks ago, we saw Labor shelve both its gambling reforms, its gambling ad reforms that had been talked about, that apparently they had a draft that nobody got to see, but then they completely shelved them. And they also shelved their entire environment protection laws. And that was something that Tanya Plibersek, the environment minister, had supposedly got a deal with the Greens and David Pocock on, but then Anthony Albanese decided, nope, that's too risky too, we'll shelve that one too. I was enjoying the repeated use of the word shelved in headlines over it was the final day of January and the first day of February. They were just shelving everything.
Well, it was shelving and also Albanese overriding some of his most senior ministers, because that happened, of course, with Tanya. It seems to be happening all the time, and we just saw again the salmon farming issue down in Tasmania being an issue where he said, right, we're going all in for jobs and environment can be secondary, which is not an uncommon kind of theme to hear. But also he did that with Mark Dreyfus over the mandatory sentencing element of the hate crimes bill. And that hate crimes bill, I think, is worth us perhaps turning our attention to at the moment, because that seemed to me to be a little bit of a needles in the strawberries moment for the Albanese government, where what they were really wanting to do is be seen to be doing something. And actually, you know, it was a response to, certainly, I mean, nobody is in any way denying that the surge in some of these anti-Semitic attacks, the graffiti, the arson attacks happening in the eastern suburbs here in Sydney, for example, that aren't appalling. But there nonetheless has been this weaponisation of this by Dutton. And so Albanese seems to be thinking, well, we have to be seen to be doing something. And so enacted legislation that, in fact, didn't really criminalise anything that wasn't already a crime. Like everything that has happened in these anti-Semitic attacks in the last couple of months, they're already crimes. But it was the response to the now infamous sort of Dural caravan, which has now perhaps been discovered to be seen that the explosives there were, 40 years old perhaps, in order to try and neutralise any sense of the attack from Dutton. So not really, again, about substance, but about performance.
This is, I guess I have lots of thoughts on this. It's sort of in my wheelhouse at the moment. This combined with my local MP, Josh Burns, running through Parliament inquiry into getting the Australian government to adopt the really horrific and disingenuous definition of anti-Semitism, that any criticism of Israel is equated to hate speech. That passing, presumably, eventually, if Australia adopts that in conjunction with these laws that were already laws, I mean, I need to talk to a lawyer about it, but it sounds like every single word I wrote last year would become illegal. And I have a problem. He's my member. I'll take that personally,
Yeah.
I mean, I find it really interesting the extreme lengths Labor has been going to, to try to respond, and they look on the back foot automatically because the coalition has been hammering this and really politicizing it and weaponizing it. But it's sort of been like, whenever Dutton says jump, Albanese says how high, that pushing for that definition, as you say, Joe, the hate speech laws, which were very much of it, it seems a needles in strawberries moment, because as we're now seeing, the precipitating incident actually may not have been terrorism or anti-Semitism, or and that is unfolding. But I really think that and that one especially, where Labor actually put mandatory sentences into that bill in contravention of their own party platform, and overruling Attorney General Mark Dreyfus, who is himself Jewish and who was, very in favour of Israel. But they just keep going further and further, and it's never actually enough for the coalition. They're going to keep saying Labor is weak on anti-Semitism, no matter what they do. But really, they've kind of let him dominate this conversation. They've from the start accepted and enabled this conflation of criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. I think back to like last June, when Labor and the coalition teamed up to like condemn the Greens for taking part in pro-Palestine protests. We've seen the sort of much faster action on an anti-Semitism envoy than an Islamophobia envoy. That was really quite embarrassing, I think, for Labor, that they promised both and then got one organised, and the other one just kind of didn't seem to matter so much. And they have partaken in this game. They have allowed the coalition and various lobby groups to suggest that what is going on, or what has been going on with protests across the country for over a year now, is anti-Semitism. Of course, anti-Semitism is a real issue, and people, we should talk about real anti-Semitism, and we should be across it, but we shouldn't conflate it all, because it's all getting very messy and very ugly, and Labor has completely lost control of this now. It came to a head for me on Monday of this week when the coalition tried to silence Mark Dreyfus for calling them out for weaponizing.
Which was just outrageous.
It's one of those, I feel like the coalition every now and then just is so galling that I think it's the most galled I've ever been. But this was Mark Dreyfus getting bullied a little bit in question time for the fact he'd been overruled on mandatory sentences, standing up, speaking about anti-Semitism, speaking about the fact that he has spoken against anti-Semitism, and then, pointing out that the coalition is politicizing it, which they are. That is just a fact. And then them trying to shut down the government's most senior Jewish MP. It was bizarre.
There's a real inability on Anthony Albanese's part to reject someone else's framework and just say, no, that's ridiculous. Actually, it's like this. He seems to need to play on the terms that Murdoch and the Liberal Party set the whole time, and appease, and eventually hope that they just leave him alone and make it, nice and comfortable for him. That will never happen. That's not how bullies operate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Imagine if right from the start, Albanese had been much firmer on the fact that criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism. And then
really the founder of the Parliamentary Friends of Palestine, you wouldn't expect him to have a different opinion on any of this, would you?
Well, I think, and it seems there is a failure at the moment of a range of our institutions when it comes to these issues, because we have seen it in the Parliament, we have seen it through the government, but we have also seen it through other institutions such as the ABC. So, Dave, you said that you were covering, or had your head into the ABC and the Lattouf case this week. It did really seem, again, that people are jumping. As you say, you haven't got responses from the chair of the ABC when you've made criticisms about some of their programming choices in the past. That doesn't seem to have been... Not everybody gets the personalised response from Ita Buttrose when they raise a complaint about something. And yet in this issue, you did have the managing director going through and checking the social media feeds of a casual presenter. You did have the chair of the board responding immediately. You did have the really quite astronomically large numbers of ABC management getting involved in the issue of a presenter who was notionally supposed to be on air for 5 days. And as Michael Bradley wrote in his piece for The Shot this week, this idea that the people who were supporting Gaza and who were, raising very real concerns about the way that the Israeli government and the IDF were enacting military strategy within high-density civilian areas is somehow activism, and somehow therefore means that you are ineligible to be impartial and on the ABC.
Well, yeah, I'm distracted by the dog. What's the dog's name?
Mac.
Okay, hi. Yeah, I mean, let's not even call it military operations. We can call it genocide. This is our own show. Michael and I both wrote about this this week, and we're both sort of stunned that no one really knew what Antoinette Lattouf did wrong, but they knew that she needed to be punished. And Michael and I both wrote about Chomsky this week, which I again think was kind of weird, but it's a sort of a Chomsky kind of week where it's very mask off evil empire over in the States, and we are seeing Ida Buttrow's internalized belief that supporting Israel is a neutral, natural, perfectly reasonable thing to do. Having sympathy for the Palestinians that are being wiped out by the IDF is activism. And I think this cuts to the core almost of why this show needs to exist. Because that is just if you compare that to human philosophy and morality, that's just utterly nonsense, but it is something we all accept right here in the West. And as the case unfolded, we just saw more and more examples of that. Did anyone else have a chance to watch along?
Yeah, I did watch Ida Buttrow's testimony on, was it Tuesday or Wednesday, and she just looked exasperated that she had to be there answering questions.
Right beneath her.
Yeah, it really was. I think the thing is with this Antoinette Lattouf case, we've also seen Peter Lawler in the last fortnight also told his services were no longer required by CEN without having retweeted events from the ground in Gaza. It's all about silencing any kind of dissent. This suggestion that anything you say about Israel is anti-Semitism or activism, in the case of Antoinette Lattouf and the ABC, to suggest that is not allowed, that people in particular roles can't speak about it without losing their jobs. It really is. It's about making sure we're not talking about this anymore. And I think the last week, it's been a really alarming week between Antoinette Lattouf, what we saw with Cairo Takeaway, the stories about the fact that
which is my local restaurant and which is the best falafel in Sydney, and really just incredible behaviour from the Daily Telegraph. And, I would be interested to know, we can ask a legal expert and perhaps report next week, whether or not actually that could be a crime of inciting hatred there. I mean, they went in deliberately to try and create a news story, failed, and then, were chased down the street by the chef there saying, "What the fuck, dude," essentially.
Yeah, and they were, the Daily Telegraph chose to send this individual from their quote-unquote undercover Jew story, which is what they supposedly called it in their system, according to Dani Sayed at Crikey, that they chose this restaurant because it has, a pro-Palestine mural on the side, presumably because it is Muslim owned, because it's just like, why pick them, when they haven't necessarily had any record of anti-Semitism? Why pick them to go to try to create an anti-Semitic incident in order to silence them, really, and in order to shame them, and to make sure you can no longer have pro-Palestine murals on the side of a building anymore.
I don't know, if this was such an anti-Semitism crisis, they wouldn't be needing to manufacture these incidents. They could just report on the ones that are out there.
Well, look, that's exactly right. And I was, as an arts worker in my day job as well, I was horrified by the Creative Australia, as its name now is, dumping of Khaled Sasabi, who had only been announced as our representative going to the Venice Biennale a few short days ago, a week ago, and then you could see the chronology. It was raised in the Australian's gossip column on the Wednesday. It was raised by the hitherto completely unknown Shadow Minister for the Arts, Claire Chandler, on Thursday in question time in the Senate. Tony Burke got in touch with Creative Australia sometime after that. There was an emergency board meeting held on Thursday night, and by Friday, despite Adrian Collette, their CEO, having said, you know, what a wonderful team it was, they were so proud to support them, reflecting the diversity and plurality of Australia's rich culture, he was dumped by Friday. And this is the organisation which is supposed to be standing up for and arguing for artists and art and freedom of artistic expression.
It's like clockwork, the way these processes seem to all mirror each other.
And wasn't the quote about this was happening because they wanted to avoid a controversial conversation? Yeah. We know that's the point of art, avoiding controversial
it's like, oh, you know, the debate would last too long. And they just basically, they folded less than 72 hours after it was written about in the Australian's gossip column.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to this idea of Labor buying into this conflation of criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism, but also institutions buying into it by folding, by saying it's actually it's too controversial to have this person in this position. You are suggesting, you are agreeing with the insinuation that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism, which it is not. But I think I wanted to say quickly to Dave's point about, if there was an anti-Semitism crisis, would there need to be manufacturing incidents, which is clearly what happened with the Daily Telegraph and Cairo Takeaway. I think it's important to note, anti-Semitism is real. I think we only have to look at the fact that Elon Musk performed two very blatant Nazi salutes within a couple of hours of Donald Trump being inaugurated as president again. But at the same time, I think the creation of fake incidents, like what we saw with Cairo Takeaway, and what seems to be starting to come out about the caravan incident, which looks like it was linked to crime gangs as opposed to anti-Semitism. All of these overinflated or forced examples are actually starting to make people doubt the very real anti-Semitism that does exist. And I think it's important, that anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism is rife in Australia, but it's not where the coalition and the Murdoch media are saying it is. But it's making people question all of it, which is really dangerous. It's boy who cried wolf kind of stuff.
I was just literally about to say the boy who cried wolf. I've been talking to Riley about that because, anyway, that's off topic. But it is making things more dangerous for people. There is very real anti-Semitism out there, but that's not what's going on here. This is about
it's about stifling criticism of Israel.
Any Palestinian isn't anti-Semitic. That is not an anti-Semitic thing to happen. And let's also talk about the fact that across the last year, we've seen the State Library of Victoria capitulate to some of this stuff, expel some Palestinian poets' residencies. We've seen the MSO, a pianist composed a piece about Gaza and just said, "Hi, I'm a musician. I've written this piece. It's about Gaza." And
more than that, it was actually about journalists being killed in Gaza and the high count of the death toll of journalists. And, the composer had actually written it as kind of this sort of commemorative elegy to those who had fallen. And all he did was explain that context, and all hell broke loose. So it does seem that we're living in kind of dark times there around censorship and how these things should be handled by the media and by us are, certainly not they're being duked out across our culture at the moment.
Can I just add before we move on is that no kind, empathetic person wants to be accused of racism or hatred of any type. And, these labels are going to lose a lot of their impact and their power if it's just... I've been called a terrorist and anti-Semite 10,000 times over the last year, and I can tell you that 15 months ago that bothered me. 15 months later, it doesn't. It's just... I think it's ridiculous now at this point.
Yeah.
Well, Sorry, Rachel.
Oh, I just also wanted to flag an excellent point I saw made by Josh Bornstein, who is representing Antoinette Lattouf, and has also written a very, very topical book on this.
Yeah, great book. We had him on our
Working
podcast.
with a brand, about how corporations and employers are controlling more and more their employees' speech. But after the Peter Lawler Sen story came out, he posted that social cohesion is undermined each time people are sacked for expressing legitimate political opinions. So all the politicians who have been so concerned about social cohesion for the last 12 months and who have used it as a reason to rush through quite dramatic anti-protest and hate speech laws might want to take a look at what is happening to social cohesion every time someone is sacked or removed from a position or a role they've been given because of making or retweeting content that has anything to do with the situation in Gaza.
Yeah, so social cohesion and also commitment to free speech, which of course is something that so many, and from particularly on the right, seem to be saying we're free speech purists, absolutists, and yet at the same time are closing down.
Greg wrote something this week in The Australian saying Jewish lives are more important than free speech. I'm not disagreeing with that, but for people who used to say free speech came above absolutely everything, they have just completely flipped their position with no explanation.
Yeah.
You're setting up ridiculous expectations for a society if your idea of social cohesion is that people don't get upset when you bomb a fucking pediatric hospital.
Yeah. I think one of the things that was interesting, the point that Crikey made this week, Rachel, was how do you go about covering people like Trump and the President of the United States in this day and age, when so much of what he's doing, this sort of ridiculous frenzy of executive orders signing in this very performative way, as if somehow his Sharpie scrawl makes all these executive orders constitutional, legal, legitimate, when all it is just, a lot of activity. Crikey has made the decision that they're only going to cover what he actually does rather than what he says. Sometimes that's going to be a difficult kind of path to tread, I would say. But talk us through a little bit about that thinking.
Yeah, look, I mean, I can't say I was involved in the thinking, but I really did appreciate Sophie, the editor-in-chief, laying out the philosophy behind that. I mean, yes, Donald Trump says a lot of stuff. As Steve Bannon, his former advisor, put it, it's flooding the zone with shit. It's intended to disorient you and give you too much to have to respond to. Sophie did say in that column, suggesting that they would only deal with what he does and not what he says. There would be exceptions, such as when he's talking about foreign policy or things that affect Australia. But yeah, it does seem like it might be easy to get sucked into he did an executive order yesterday about defunding public schools that require vaccines. And I got whacked up about it on social media, but it's it's all just, his executive orders are just him with his Sharpie in the Oval Office. And it is important to focus on what he does. And I think there are very important exceptions. And for me, that is, the fact that Donald Trump, in recent weeks has suggested ethnically cleansing Gaza. And I do think we need to talk about that. It's not something he's doing yet, but it is something that we should be talking about. And I think that our leaders, who are also trying to ignore most of what he does, should be talking about and explicitly calling out, because it is moving the Overton window in a really, really dangerous way. But yes, at the same time, you can't actually deal with all of the bullshit that is circling around us at all times at the moment.
It's by design. There's too much bullshit. I think we just look for the patterns in what he says. And really cling on to that Overton window shifting point, because when I was writing my column this week, I was really put back into the headspace of 2001 when the Tampa and 9/11 had happened. And because the things the politicians and the media were now saying were ever so slightly more overtly xenophobic, it made all the people around me ever so slightly more overtly xenophobic. And I remember that, previously sensible people that I felt were kind and compassionate, all of a sudden became really scared of poor people in boats. And I think we're just in for a horrendous time with Trump normalizing the way he's talking about building a fucking casino in Gaza.
Some of it you wonder, which doesn't make it better, but is he following kind of Nixon's madman theory in geopolitical terms, where because he will say so many crazy things, it sort of destabilizes the way everybody feels, and they don't know how seriously to take him, and therefore, exactly as you say, Dave, it can sort of shift the Overton window and the debate, and so more things become more possible in his strategy. Gaza, we're going to make it the Riviera of the Middle East. What the fuck? Then everybody thinks, well, if that is a possibility, then we have to prevent that from happening at all costs, and therefore more concessions will be made as part of the discussions. I mean, J.D. Vance, honestly, he went off to the Munich Security Conference and then just brought the insane culture wars that they have had success with politically in America to Europe, and you could just see all of the serious people that in the audience just looking at him thinking, what the hell are you talking about, Vance? And yet they are now the people that Europe has to deal with, and you can see the way that's playing out now with the possible the peace negotiations with Ukraine and Russia that apparently are going to only take place between America and Russia. And last time I looked, America wasn't actually a participant on the ground in this war, and Europe is being kept, not just Ukraine, but Europe as well, being kept off the table, but yet may then be obliged to police whatever peace plan they come up with. So this notion that you can say crazy things, but it's not then going to have an impact in the broader geopolitical sphere, and indeed is designed to have an impact, I think, is what makes this also dangerous.
Mm-hmm. I think the other thing worth, I suppose, constantly trying to work out how Donald Trump does what he does and how he floods his own and how he controls the media ecosystem. It's worth us keeping track of that as we watch it happen here and as we try to work out, I suppose, how to cover Temu Trump, as Amy Ramirez has dubbed Peter Dutton, because it's pretty clear he's picking up bits and pieces that suit him.
It's embarrassing how much he's picked up, isn't it? He's appointed who did he appoint as chair of government efficiency?
Well, this is Jacinta Price.
Doge. It's not Doge. We have it's very similar. We have our own.
Yeah, it's not the department. It's the shadow minister of government efficiency. Yeah, is that? And the funny thing about that was he apparently had forgotten that he'd already appointed James Stevens, the invisible member for Sturt, who's now confronting his own independent challenger with Dr. Verity Cooper down there in South Australia. But he'd already appointed him to the remarkably similar sounding role of Assistant Minister for the Elimination of Government Wastage.
And doesn't that just go to the point to prove that actually this is just announceables and there's nothing going on here whatsoever? This just sounds good to the Trump nuts that will vote for Dutton anyway.
Yeah. Well, apparently it was Gina Reinhardt specifically pushing for Australia for the coalition to implement a policy of equivalent to Elon Musk's Doge. I thought it was funny that Peter Dutton had accidentally appointed two people to this fake role, because that's what Donald Trump originally did. He actually had two people to head up the Doge department, but one of them didn't make it, and Elon Musk ended up fully in control of that. But yeah, that is directly pulling from what's going on in Trump land.
Yeah, it is. And I think, look, Dutton, similarly, I mean, Dutton doesn't have any policies at the moment to announce. He's got his nuclear fig leaf, which nobody believes will actually ever happen, even if the coalition were to win government. And even Christopher Pyne built that particular cap, that it is just an excuse for them to be able to maintain, gas and coal, but to be able to say that they're dealing with climate change. Look, here we have a policy, and then apart from that, it seems the only other thing they have is the long lunches. So all he has at the moment are these culture war-based activities. And
sorry, go on, Jo.
no, you go on.
I was going to say he doesn't have any policies, but I think the real way in which he's going to try and ape Trump is in trying to speak to the working class and trying to speak to people who are really suffering under what is usually called the cost of living crisis, but I prefer to call it an inequality crisis. There are people who are really suffering and who have suffered even more in the last 3 years, not necessarily because Labor made things worse, but they didn't make things better as they continued to get worse. And so I think Peter Dutton, even without any policies, might have the knack for speaking to this group of people. He wants to try to win the outer suburbs. There is some polling today showing he's competitive in like 20 marginal seats. He wants to win the outer suburbs. He wants to win working class people. And like Trump, he might not actually have anything to offer them. He might not actually have any policies that are going to help them. But if he can make them think he's on their side and that Labor just wants to tax them, and also they're the elites and whatever else he pinches from Trump.
The voice playbook.
Yeah, and we've heard elites here before.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that actually could be rich territory for him, partly because Labor has done very little to help these people. As much as Anthony Albanese loves to reel off all the different things they've done this term, people haven't felt it. People are.
Look, they are struggling.
Like
I think,
Dutton,
though, we're not the US. And we do have, I think because of compulsory voting and because of preferential voting, there are potentially different ways in which this could play out here in Australia. Rachel seems to have frozen a bit on the screen. I have now worked out how we can play our Richard Dennis interviews. So as we're coming up to 10 o'clock, Dave, maybe with a frozen Rach and a disappeared Anthony, maybe, and apparently we didn't stream on YouTube. So here we are in week 1, really working it all out for you, but we will have it all under control for next week. But what we might do is close out with Richard and look forward to kind of coming back next week with a more technically seamless approach to the Sunday Shot. Do you have any, Dave, top tips for the week ahead that you would like to talk about?
Before we move on, I just want to quickly add that we're only in a position where Peter Dutton can go to the electorate with no policies, nothing outlined, and still be a viable contender because our media sucks so badly.
Yeah, I think that, yeah.
Insiders last week, where maybe the week before, interviewed Dutton, no policies, no numbers, no nothing. David Spears gets back to the couch and says, right, we're assuming that they're going to spend less money and be more responsible with their money than the Labor Party, aren't we? And Laura Tingle pushed back on that because she's good at her job, but the assumption was just baked in, we have these electoral myths and we're going to run with them this time again.
And I think that is exactly why we are here to do what we are doing, which is to try and reframe the conversations. And some of that is what Richard talks about in the interviews. Richard Dennis, welcome to the very first edition of the Sunday Shot.
Very excited and honoured to be here.
What I thought that we might do, given the fantastic research and policy development work that the Australia Institute does as a matter of course, is talk a little bit about what are the big ideas. I know you've just produced a book on this very subject for your 30th anniversary. What are the big ideas that we should be aspiring to as a nation, that we should be looking to our governments and indeed those who wish to be an alternative government to put before us? And then what do we think is the best that's likely to be offered by both of the major parties at this particular moment in time?
I just want to talk about my meta idea, which I think is going to span a few things that we'll talk about today. And that is the need for bravery in politics, the need for bravery in policy debate. Because frankly, if we can't put big ideas on the table to solve big problems, then we get stuck having this bizarre, but I find impossible to engage in debate about, is something tiny and ineffective better than nothing? Yeah. Because I don't know the answer to that. Like, who said nothing was the option? Yet so much time in Australia is spent arguing whether something is better than nothing, rather than is the proposal on the table going to make a material effect to the thing that we're trying to look at.
I think that's one of the things that you've been talking about in this anniversary year of the Australia Institute about. That's what what you've been trying to do, is to say we can open up our thinking. Why is it that we have become so narrow-minded and technocratic that we've stopped looking for big solutions, and we are tinkering around the edges in ridiculous ways? There was this great quote, actually, which I'll read, from an American Twitter star who's just entering local politics potentially, and he's talking about the Democratic Party. He says the fundamental flaw with the Democratic Party is that they do not recognise themselves as political leaders who drive and shape public opinion, but see themselves as especially powerful bureaucrats. And I think that the Labor Party is caught up in that kind of thinking as well.
Absolutely. And let's be clear, that's not what Gough Whitlam was thinking. That's not what Bob Hawke was thinking. That's not what Paul Keating was thinking. And while he had trouble implementing, that wasn't what Kevin Rudd was thinking. So we need to be careful not to catastrophize. This is not an inevitable feature of Australian politics, but it's the dominant feature right now. Why is that? Well, yeah, look, that's a podcast in itself, but to be clear, I think what we're seeing is that the rise of the kind of technocratic tinkering is actually the best defense for the status quo. Like, for those that are kind of happy with the way things are, the people that are kind of happy with multi-million-dollar tax-free capital gain on their houses, the kind of people that are happy that we're still expanding fossil fuel production, not transitioning away from it, the people that are happy with the current distribution of income and the way the cost of living crisis seems to affect some people more than others. If you're kind of happy with the way things are, but most people want change, why not trick them into having a big fight about a small change? Because then worst case scenario, you cop a small change. So yeah, whenever someone's winning, whenever someone's losing, someone's winning. So, my pitch to people is think about who's winning, think about who's happy with things the way they are. Are we having a housing crisis? Are the houses in crisis? No, the houses are doing fine. Are rich people making huge capital gains having a crisis? No, they think it's coming along quite nicely. So hearing major political parties agree with the masses that there's a housing crisis, but then agree to only tinker, would the media be so naive as to fall for that?
I mean, when it comes to housing, one of the things that I did find interesting to learn, because people talk a lot about housing supply and that there's a shortage of supply, and so we need to be building, we need to be ensuring we have greater density in some of our suburbs and that kind of thing. But one of the chapters in your book that Maya Zizi had written, where she was saying, well, actually, it's not so much supply, it's what we're doing with the houses, and that is providing them to investors to make money rather than to people to live in. And I must say, given the debate that had been going on, I did genuinely believe that it was partly, at least, an issue in the sheer number of houses that were available for people to live in.
Yeah, no, not at all. Look, a lot of people think they're cynical about politics. A lot of people think they're cynical about kind of PR and spin. In my experience, people aren't nearly cynical enough. So let me give you the best reframe in modern history, the best spin in modern history. You know who the good guys are in this housing crisis? The property developers. Just the plucky little property developers. All they want to do is build houses to help poor people, and the evil, oppressive state, the dead hand of bureaucracy, is just standing between the plucky little property developers and all the poor people missing out on housing. I mean, that's genius. That is some A-grade PR. Well done, whoever's doing PR for the property people. Good on you. And to be clear, the property developers aren't breaking the law often. Sometimes they do. But they're actually just doing their job, which is making as much money as they can, building houses as cheap as they can, selling them to the richest people they can find. That's their job. Yeah. So well done them. But here we are in a housing crisis, and it's like, oh, if only the property developers could help the poor. Let me tidy this up for you, Joe. We are building holiday homes for the holiday homeless.
Right.
We are not building housing for the homeless.
No, we're not. And one of the things that May also had said was that it wasn't that long ago that almost 1 in 4 houses were being built by the government, and 1 in 3 renters, and this was as late as the 1980s, were renting from the government. So what has happened in the interim? Why have we just given this over to the private sector, given them responsibility for supplying and distributing, when, as you say, their motives are very, very different?
The same reason we privatised the Commonwealth Bank, just to help ordinary people. The same reason we privatised the GAO, to help poor people insure their homes. The same reason we privatised Qantas, to help poor people fly more often. Right? Come on, this is not unusual. Like, we used to build houses where they were needed and rent them to people who needed them. Let's call that the old-fashioned way.
Yeah.
And then we had a better idea, which was to have big tax breaks, particularly the 50% capital gains tax discount. And we said, if we make investing in housing profitable enough, maybe there'll be an increase in investment in rental properties, and maybe those properties will get rented to poor people, and maybe they'll get rented to poor people at low prices. And whoopsie. So, I don't know what link in that incredibly strong chain broke down, but let's be honest, we used to do it, the old way. And I don't know if you've heard of Europe. They kind of tend to still do this, but of course that's like socialism, I think. Even when the right are in power in Germany, they're still socialists. So we've just kind of abandoned truth. We've abandoned sort of facts. We've abandoned evidence. We embraced neoliberal theory that said, let's make investors rich and the benefits will trickle down to the poor. And I don't know, maybe a few economists like me suggested it wouldn't work. But can I give you a fun example of how dumb this is?
Please do.
All right. So there's something in Australia called the Defence Housing Authority.
Yep.
It's a Commonwealth authority that provides housing to people who work in defence. Very complicated to understand. A Commonwealth authority that provides housing to defence. And stick with me, I know I'm getting into high finance here. What they do is they buy land and they build houses on it, and then they rent the houses to people who work in defence at subsidised rate. Do I need to repeat it?
I'm glad you took me through that slowly.
Okay, it's real high finance stuff here. And sometimes they hang on to those properties and collect the rent, and sometimes they sell the properties like a property developer does for a significant profit. So the Defence Housing Authority makes a profit. Yeah. So imagine, just stick with me because I'm going to make it really complex. Imagine if we deleted the word defence from the Defence Housing Authority Act, and we just had a housing authority. Just putting it out there.
Yeah.
I mean, who would be able to run such a thing? I don't know, maybe the people currently running such a thing. How would we possibly afford to do that? I don't know, maybe it'd continue to make a profit. So, we're just stuck. We're just stuck in Australia. And then we have to, we've just spent 5 minutes talking about housing. Wouldn't it have been so much better to fight about whether something tiny and ineffective was better than nothing? Imagine if we, what are we wasting our time talking pie in the sky things that would work for when we could debate the politics, the strategy behind the thing?
And the thing that even when it comes to the policies that have been put forward, whether it's first home buyers grants or in the case of the coalition, this sort of notion that people should just raid their supers because that, of course, is what super was for. And, of course, all 30 to 35-year-olds have vast amounts of supers just sitting around ready to be invested in housing. But that really only goes to the question of saving the deposit. And the bigger question really is the debt-to-income ratio, that people can't afford to service the debts that they would now be required to take out to buy a house in this insanely overheated housing market of ours.
Yeah, and it's worse than that. And see, the
Cheer me
weird
up.
thing is, the weird thing is, in Australia, we talk about the economy all the time. We very rarely ask an economist, to help us understand a problem. And to be clear, you shouldn't ask economists what to do, like what the solution is. Like, you don't ask the waiter what you feel like for dinner, but you do ask the waiter, what's on the menu here? And, but for a society that talks about the economy so much, you very rarely actually hear an economist getting asked about what we could do. You just hear economists who are paid by someone to tell you what we should do. So here's where an economist would help. Economists have this thing called the fallacy of composition. That's a bit of a fancy name, but it just means that sometimes things work for individuals that don't work when we all do it. If I went to you or your kids and said, look, if I gave you 50 grand and you went to an auction, if you had an extra 50 grand, you reckon that might help you get a foot in the door? And they're like, yeah, that'd be great. Because they're thinking, I can outbid the person next to me. That 50 grand is going to be really helpful for me. It's a head start for me. But if I go to the auction and give everybody an extra 50 grand, you know who wins? The person selling the house.
That's right. It just overheats the market more. And in fact, Jane Hume even had to concede that during the last election campaign. And yet they're bringing it back this time round. And that is, in fact, the coalition's only housing policy that I've thus far been able to discern.
Well, let's be clear. That's clever. Let's be clear. That's smart. Let's be clear. That will help win them votes. Because the people who own the houses get it.
Yeah.
They're like, fantastic. What you're going to do is stuff money into the pockets of the people who are bidding to buy my house. Thank you, Jane Hume. Well done, you. And a whole bunch of young people who are too busy to be paying so much attention because they're, working 2 jobs to try and save up the deposit. Just hear, someone's going to give me 50 grand. Fantastic. So we just have to admit that in Australia, our political class is just trolling us. There is no housing crisis, right? This is just going to push houses up even higher for people who own multiple houses. And in other news, the Liberals are happy with that.
They certainly are. It is just a shame that the Labor Party seems happy with that as well. You have quite a famous quote, I think, which has sort of gone around the traps, where you say in Norway, they tax the fossil fuel industry and they give university education to their kids for free. In Australia, we subsidise the fossil fuel industry and we charge our kids a fortune to go to uni. And that's actually even been fact-checked now by the ABC and found to check out.
Sure has.
So tax, it seems to be almost a verboten subject in Australian politics, apart from to advise people you're going to give them more tax cuts, even as what we need to spend just grows and grows. What kind of choices could Australia be making on the taxation front so that we weren't doing such kind of counterintuitive things?
Well, let's start at the beginning. Australia is one of the lowest taxed countries in the developed world. Choosing my words carefully there for those that want to go and fact check it. Australia is one of the lowest taxed countries in the developed world. We are not a high tax country. We are not a high tax country. I'm not avoiding the simplicity of what I'm saying, but it's heresy to say it in Australia. Okay, it's heresy. Like, I get fact checked for what I told you about Norway. It's all from the budget papers. Like, what's to fact check? But there is so much power. There is so many entitled, loud voices in Australia shouting, we're high tax, it'll ruin the economy, that, when an actual economist pulls numbers out of the actual budget papers, it's like, hit the red light. Oh, my God, get the fire trucks. Someone's saying the obvious. So that's how kind of broken our political debate is. Why am I saying this? Well, because if Australia collected about the average amount of tax that European countries do, just the average, if we went from being a low tax country to an average tax country, we'd collect about an extra $100 billion a year in revenue.
$100 billion.
And that would push us all the way to average.
Yeah. Wow.
That wouldn't make us high tax.
Yeah.
And you know what we could do with $100 billion a year? Well, pretty much anything that a democracy wanted to do.
Yeah.
I say all the time, we're a rich country. We can afford to do anything we want, but not everything we want. And this is what democracy is supposed to be about. This is what budgets are about, is prioritising who gets the lollies and who misses out. So because more than half of the gas we export is given away to gas companies for free, zero royalties. Because we do that, we miss out on tens of billions in revenue. Because we then subsidise the fossil fuel industry, that's another 14 billion a year. Because of superannuation tax concessions that benefit the wealthy, because of capital gains tax concessions that overwhelmingly support the wealthy. Because of all that, we're a low tax country. And if we wanted to, I don't know, make people that own 3 houses pay more tax, or make the foreign gas industry pay some tax, well, we could have free childcare like they do in most of Europe, or we could have actual proper free public health like we used to, like they do in most of Europe. Right. So higher tax countries than us in Europe, where the fossil fuel industry pays some tax, where they don't have a 50% discount on capital gains tax, the price they pay, the horror they endure, the burden of all this extra tax is things like free childcare and free dental care and actual free healthcare.
Richard, look, thank you very much for being our very first guest on the Sunday Shot. It's been great to have you, and we look forward to hearing more from you as the election campaign heats up.
Can't wait. And thanks for doing this. What an exciting initiative.
Thank you.
That's it for our first technically plagued issue for The Shot. Sorry for those who tried to watch us on YouTube. We'll be on to that next week. We will be back next Sunday at 9 a.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time. When Insiders comes on, jump over to YouTube and Facebook and onto Blue Sky, and off we'll go for week 2. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks. Did anyone pick up on the not so subtle plug for Ronnie's book?
Get out and buy New Australian Fiction. Fabulous.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.